Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, the Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you're getting sort of value entertainment out of these videos, all I ask that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. Before we get into this week's video, I just want to let you know I am doing more sort of one-on-one interviews. Last week we had Scott Terrio, the debt consultant, on. This week, April 21st at 10 a.m., I'm going to be interviewing IceCap asset manager Keith Dicker. Keith is highly respected in the finance space. He's actually locally based in Canada, and so if you read any of his reports over the past 6 months or so, I think he highlights a lot of important topics. I tend to agree with a lot of his theses. He's obviously proven to be very, very accurate given what's happening. I highly encourage you to check that out. If you in the link in the description below, I'm going to put a Zoom link to join and subscribe to that webinar. The webinar again is at 10 a.m. on the 21st. It's a live webinar, and at the end we're going to open it up to Q&A, so it should be highly entertaining and engaging. For those that are interested, we're basically going to be focusing on the outlook for the Canadian economy, the outlook for the Canadian dollar, the housing market, provincial debt markets. Basically, if you are a Canadian investor looking to not only preserve your money but actually make money, I think it's going to be a pretty engaging conversation, so check that out. But this week, obviously for this week's video, the Bank of Canada back in action. Our boy Stephen Poloz, his final interview or his final meeting at the helm of the Bank of Canada. I'm sure that guy can't get out of there fast enough given the absolute gong show that they are dealing with right now. Not really any surprises. The bank kept interest rates where they are at 0.25%. This is what they deem to be the effective lower bound, meaning that there is basically, in their view, there's no point in lowering interest rates any further because it won't actually have any stimulative impact. In fact, it may actually have negative impacts, which I personally think it will. So they've hit their effective lower floor. What they're basically doing is just flooding the market now with basically QE. They've extended their purchasing into the provincial bond market and into the corporate bond market. Obviously, these are two markets where the spreads just blew out. Provincial bond markets, if we didn't know this, if you had read Keith Dicker's letter with IceCap, is that the provincial bond markets in Canada are roughly 5 times more illiquid than the federal bond market. So those spreads basically blew out, and so that's why the Bank of Canada had to basically come in, because you can't have the interest rates rising significantly on provincial debt because believe it or not, a lot of these provinces are heavily indebted, and the interest cost alone is significantly, they have to keep those interest rates suppressed, so that's why the Bank of Canada had to step in. But I have to give just to put into context kind of what is happening right now, that the same day that the Bank of Canada came out with their monetary policy report and their announcement of their expansion of these QE programs, it was the same day that GDP for March came in at negative 9% on a month-over-month basis. This was the single largest decline on a month-over-month basis in history. So that's historic in its own nature. And things are the outlook is so uncertain that the Bank of Canada, for the first time under Stephen Poloz's watch, didn't release a forecast for the next quarter GDP. They just said Q2 GDP will decline anywhere from 15%, negative 15%, to negative 30%. That's the range. So these guys literally have no idea. They basically just took a flyer and said, look, this is so wild and out of control and so many unknowns that we're just going to throw out a broad range and say that basically shit's going to hit the fan in Q2. It's between 15 to 30%. I have to laugh because at the end of all this, I'm watching Poloz's interview, streaming it on online there, and he gives this pressing thought. Someone asked him, well, Mr. Poloz, what do you say to Canadian consumers currently facing, I think, the sharpest decline in Canadian consumer confidence? Obviously, people are losing their jobs and, so isolated at home. It's a very depressing environment. What do you say to that? And he says, quote, I'm going to quote Mr. Poloz. He says, well, what they have to look forward to is the lowest interest rates that we've seen in a very, very long time. So if their plans involve borrowing in order to achieve those plans, whether that's to buy a new vehicle or make a new renovation to their home or buy a house, that those interest rates will be very low, and we therefore have a lot of pieces in place for the recovery to be robust. So I think they should be very positive about the outlook. I just don't understand. I mean, I understand from a policymaker's perspective that you have to kind of just put out the positive outlook, but in what world are Canadians going to be gorging on this low debt? They don't have any jobs. 600,000 Canadians have now deferred their mortgages at the big banks. That's roughly 12% of the big banks' portfolio. You now have 7.5 million Canadians have applied or have been approved for that CERB program, the Canada Emergency Response Program, and that's nearly 40% of the entire labor force. Nearly 40% of the entire labor force has been given and requested a check for $2,000. And that is basically only a month sort of into this whole scheme. So obviously we can expect those numbers to increase even more. Now, keep in mind that yes, there's people that are obviously going to cheat the system. They're maybe earning an income and they're going to go and try to get a free handout. But irregardless, these numbers are massive and they're going to continue to grow. Again, I believe that the moral hazard of all of this is really concerning, and that's why I've said, given the outlook, this is the massively deflationary environment. Again, unemployment. We know it's going to hit double digits. The estimates range from 15% to 20% to, I've heard, as high as 30%. I actually think the number could end up being higher. I just really don't see a whole lot of people today, if you look around, that are actually really genuinely working. And so I think the unemployment rate is going to be substantial. That is massively, massively, massively deflationary. But I think my true belief, my conviction, if I had money to deploy, which I do, and this is part of my thesis, I believe that we are in a deflationary environment, probably for the next year, maybe 18 months, potentially a little bit longer, and then you're going to rip into a significantly inflationary environment. I think we're going through a regime shift where basically the amount of intervention that central banks are doing, I think, again, is created significantly a moral hazard. Propping up these, corporate zombies and bailing out hedge funds, for example. That this is creating a moral hazard. It's creating, it's basically like the end. If you ever thought there was capitalism, it feels like capitalism has basically died. But again, so my view on that again is, this is the reality of what is happening. Morally, I think it is very wrong. It's morally bankrupt. But as an investor, as someone that at the end of the day is just trying to make money, I think you have to basically shut out your emotions and you have to basically roll with that. So even though, for example, you might not think, and again, I'm not saying this is the bottom of the stock market, but whether the stock market goes down, say 30% or 40% peak to trough, maybe we retest those lows, you could arguably say, well, given where the unemployment rate is, it probably should have dropped 80%. But you basically can't fight the Fed. It's essentially like they're basically bailing everybody out. And it's the same, that's kind of my same view on the housing market as well. I think that we're going to have a correction here. I think it'll be a meaningful correction, but I think that people that believe it's going to be, 2008 2.0, 50% declines, that is not my view. Personally, I will come out and say right now, that is not my view. And the reason for that is because of CMHC, OSFI, the Bank of Canada. The amount of intervention is truly, truly unprecedented. Again, they aren't going to be able to fix this. You can't force businesses to rehire people. It's going to take many years for these jobs to come back. For context, we have eviscerated all the job creation from the financial crisis up until the pandemic. We have wiped out every single one of those new jobs that has been created over that 10-year span. That is going to take many years to get those jobs back. I think a lot of them won't come back, period. We're now talking about universal basic income. Again, I think we're going down the lines of MMT, modern monetary theory, where essentially we are going to get that inflation. I think it could take a year or maybe a couple years, but it will come. And that is truly my belief. Trudeau's still talking about at least a couple more weeks before we start to, get into this reopening phase. I suspect my view again is that you're going to get that second wave. We're already starting to see it in other parts of the world. Singapore is one of the largest, best cases out there. They shut the economy down. They had the virus completely under control. They reopened, and now the cases are growing exponentially once again. So I think that's probably the likely scenario here, unfortunately. So there's going to be more pain in the months ahead. And we're obviously getting now revisions out of China, like surprise, surprise. I just find it amazing how ignorant and naive people in the media can truly be. Like the numbers out of China were always fake. The fact that you're telling me, Wuhan got completely shut down and people basically barricaded into their homes, and that this thing somehow magically didn't spread to the big cities of Beijing and Shanghai, just very suspicious. The numbers out of Wuhan, the deaths, China's now saying that they were actually, quote unquote, 50% higher. 50, not like 51 or 52 or 53%, 50%, dead flat 50%. And of course GDP contracted 6.8%. 6.8. It's like the GDP always goes up 6.8, 6.8, and then it went, this quarter went down 6.8. Not like 6.7 or 6.6, but 6.8. So these guys basically just make up all their numbers. There's really no point in looking at them. All you can really do is unfortunately rely on Western democracies and see that the case severity in many of these cities and countries is obviously severe in some cases. So that's all I got for this week. Again, I highly encourage you to join the webinar link if you are interested in a further deeper conversation on the Canadian economy and the outlook, and maybe how investors can pivot and allocate. Again, I think that's where Keith really shines, so I'm going to let him sort of take it from there. If you've got any sort of value or entertainment out of this video, hit thumbs up and subscribe.